This session today is, first of all, before I do that, I want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory and the traditional lands of the Métis people. So we have three sessions today, three presentations during this session, and I'm the first one. My name's Paul Orlowski, and there we are. I'm a professor here in the College of Education, and what I'm going to talk about is adolescent thinking around climate change and economic uncertainty, a study that I did in Nelson, BC. Yeah, start the timer, thank you. We each have 15 minutes, and we'll do questions at the end. Here's the overview of the presentation. I'm eventually going to get to the study, but I am going to do a lot of background for, I want to also say it's pretty funny. When I have a grad student who has a 15-minute thesis defense, I always say 15 slides. Well, I've got 26, so do as I say, not as I do. I'm going to go through, set the context for this study and what I think some concepts that need to be understood, like neoliberalism, if we're actually going to take on climate change properly. Then I'm going to talk briefly about other sociology studies. This is a qualitative study that I did interviewing these teenagers. And then I'll talk about this particular study. So climate science. It's here too, good. 97% of climate scientists, I'll just look here, have concluded that human-caused climate change is happening. So there's 3% who don't. Of the 3%, some of them are using flawed research. The 97% have actually gone to look at the 3% that say, no, climate change isn't happening, and found flaws. Or they're intentional flaws. They're like maybe on the payroll of big oil, and I think that might be talked about a little bit later on in one of the presentations after this. With few exceptions, this is a NASA study. Each month since October 2015 set atmospheric record temperatures. There's more powerful and frequent hurricanes and forest fires, more extreme droughts, rising ocean levels, warming oceans. And we know this isn't part of climate science. The next one, the Paris Agreement, November 2015, made an arbitrary limit of 2 degrees warmer that we can get to. Those were political people coming up with 2 degrees. The scientists afterwards said that's a little high. It should be 1.5 degrees max before it's irreversible, and we won't be able to stop it. Of that 1.5, we've now gone 0.8 degrees more. So we're getting close. We're over the halfway point. We have a problem. There were 2 countries that did not sign on to the Paris Agreement. One was Syria, and they were in civil war. We could cut them a little bit of a slack. And Nicaragua they didn't think it went far enough, which is kind of surprising. But since then, the Paris Agreement, some of you know this was 4 days before Donald Trump was elected, and he's pulled the Americans out. So that is a key problem. And then you know the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year said we have 12 years. 1 year's down, we have 11 more years to pull this off before it's irreversible. Now, I'll just talk about neoliberalism, which is a term some people know in the academy. It basically means the corporate agenda. These are the traits of it. It started with Margaret Thatcher. Well, actually started with Chile when Pinochet did the coup d'etat in Chile. But it really got going with Thatcher and Reagan, and then Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien here in Canada. And these are the traits: corporate tax cuts. All of these are geared toward making shareholders make more money. Privatizing of the commons, deregulation of the private sector. At the same time, extreme regulation of the public sector. That's a trait of neoliberalism, to say private is good, public is bad. And and any of you who are teachers here know with the standardized testing and that kind of thing, teachers are being held accountable much more than other sectors. In fact, what gave rise to the Idle No More was the Harper government deregulating fresh water. And so the indigenous movement said, they want fresh water. All Canadians want fresh water, but actually the media didn't frame it that way at all. In fact, it got into racist discourses. And weakened collective bargaining rights, or union busting. So those are the traits of neoliberalism. The corporate agenda is what we used to call it. A long time ago, a really similar and discredited economic paradigm called laissez-faire economics was the norm. It was very similar to that. Obstacles to public awareness, the mainstream media's coverage of climate change. Now, this is an interesting one, just hot off the press. Justin Trudeau's Liberal government want to do a carbon tax. It's a good first step. It's only a first step. But the media have actually had 8-1. This was a study done by Cambridge University. Came out like last week. The Canadian media had 8 stories knocking the carbon tax and saying how people were upset with the carbon tax for one story that would say that this is good. So an 8-1 ratio. So, you know, they're doing their thing. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised corporate media have corporate interests. I'm actually quite surprised the CBC is now tending to side with the corporate media outlets. That's different. And that changed when Stephen Harper changed the board of the CBC, and it hasn't been changed since. Also, let's see, the blurred climate change denial movement. Now that's funded by the Koch brothers, Big Oil. They did the same thing with cigarette companies when they were going to get sued for causing lung cancer. They get scientists to say this isn't happening, or in this case, they have so-called think tanks that come up with all sorts of strategies on how not to deal with climate change. The blurred separation of oil and state is that the politicians are actually either from the oil industry, like Condoleezza Rice. Do you remember her? Condoleezza Rice was the Secretary of State under Bush. She was like top, I don't know if she was CEO, really close to it, of Chevron Oil. Stephen Harper, he used to work with Exxon, and his father used to work with Exxon. And this is kind of a common thing. And a lot in the Trump cabinet administration today are also people from fossil fuel industries. Public access to scientific research. I know I'm talking a little faster than I normally do, but it's this 15-minute thing here. Public access to scientific research. You might remember that Stephen Harper said we're paying for the scientific research as taxpayers, and he said they weren't allowed to share their research findings on climate change or any environmental issue with the public. Trump's doing the same thing. An intimidation of scientists and journalists. Well, it goes without speaking, so I'll just move on. Now, political ideology and climate change. For me, this is important. We have to figure out how to do this. I read this study of the sociologist Dunlap in 2016 said this is a problem, actually. So we know that the Republican Party has this base. They've joined God, gun, gays, and abortion. And we all know, yeah, that's that core Republican, what they're interested in. But climate change is now part of that. So that's really tough to talk to an ideologue who's so entrenched in conservatism. In Canada, let's see here. In Canada, 41%, this is 2014, I don't know how it's shifted since. 41% of conservative supporters believe in human-induced climate change. To be honest, I didn't think it was that high because none of their politicians seem to be taking it seriously. And 69% of Liberal supporters, 76% of NDP supporters. They didn't have Green in the study. I'm sure they'd be pretty close to 100. And maybe the Liberal and NDP support has changed slightly too. But anyway, ideology does matter. It really does. I think the gloves, I do believe in that 12-year limit that's now 11 years. I believe it's time to not take a neutral stance. I don't think it helps anybody to say teaching, like, don't favor one side or the other. Rome is burning. It's time to take the gloves off, and let's talk about climate change denying and the stances of conservatism. Not just on climate change. I would say the same thing around race, gender, sexuality too, but I teach anti-oppression education here. And this is a conservative province, and the rural people generally, not all, obviously, but they like conservatism, right? It comes out in the voting patterns, and I do take it on. I just don't think this is healthy with climate change and the other issues I just talked about. Okay, so I was part of an environmental, sort of a radical environmental group in the early 1980s in Toronto, and that's where I learned about a lot of environmental research. And Sweden had this research on the greenhouse effect in the 1970s. And so I remember thinking, wow, okay, we got to deal with this. And I still remember the conservative discourses and corporate discourses at the time saying global warming is nonsense. That was back then. In the 2000s, a new discourse appeared. Global warming may be happening, but it's just natural. And then lately, I've heard this too. And some of you have heard it too. Climate change may be happening, but it's too late to do anything. And to be honest, I was even predicting that back in the 90s, that once we get to that point, they'll be saying it's getting too late. Okay, taking on discourse 2, yes, there's been fluctuation in carbon dioxide, the number 1 greenhouse gas. But that's where it went to. This was from, I can't read that, but it's like 400,000 years ago or something. It's going back a ways. But now, since 1950 to now, look how high it is. So yes, there's been fluctuation. The last ice age was 10,000 years ago, but we're way beyond that with carbon dioxide here. I'm hearing conservatives saying it's good to have lots of carbon dioxide in the air now. That's more coming out of the United States. Okay, now these are the guys who are getting elected. What bugs me about this is 77% of Canadians say they want government to take care of, to start dealing with climate change. 77%, not bad. These guys are getting elected. Well, Scheer isn't in there yet, but he could get in there, and I'm not a big fan of Scheer getting elected there. So what do I have? We're running out of time here already. Okay. Anyway, you know, Ford, and they're all challenging Justin Trudeau's carbon tax. This is going to be a problem. Nice looking group, eh? These are our leaders. Anyway, sorry to leave that. I'll quickly switch that. It's not an image we want. Findings from other sources. I'll just do this. In Norway, Norgard says this psychological distancing is an interesting thing. It's kind of like, yeah, maybe there's climate change, and maybe the South Pacific Islands, the ocean levels are rising, it's going to be trouble, but it's not for us here in Norway. And that was 2006. A lot of studies happened in Norway earlier on. Media and political inaction, Rygaard and company said that the problems are the media aren't convincing us, and the politicians aren't doing anything, so it's probably not that big a deal. Now that was Norway in 2010. Most Norwegians, and this is Norwegians, I mean, they're kind of progressive in a lot of ways, believe climate change is real, but they don't want to fight it if the standard of living drops. That's probably pretty common even here in Canada. And then there's this concept called psychic numbing. It was Norgard doing a follow-up to the 2006 study. Psychic numbing is it's just too overwhelming, and we can't do anything about it. That one I understand. It does seem, I mean, this resurgence of the alt-right or white supremacy, there's a lot of things that seem overwhelming. How do we deal with this? And now 2 studies did look at how youth understand climate change. It was in Australia and US Midwest, but it was just about how they understand science. My study had a lot to do with the economy too, and neoliberalism. So I did, Nelson's down here, really close to the Alberta border, and Idaho and Montana right down there. Hands up, have you been to Nelson, just out of curiosity? Okay, yeah, a lot of you. It's kind of pretty, right? Anyway, and if you don't believe me, there's a picture of Nelson. So I spent my summers there, and I interviewed 10 youth last year. Let's see. Here's the research question. How do BC adolescents intellectually process ongoing debates about climate change in an uncertain economy? The objectives, I'm going to move fast because we've got to go here. Recruiting and methodology, I did the snowball sampling. And I got 10, by the way, this was my master's student interviewed 10 students here in Saskatoon, and we were going to compare the results. We're going to present those at CSSE in Vancouver in a few weeks, but she couldn't make it here. Okay, here are the findings. We'll now just go fast, and I know this is a lot of text. The quotes are down at the bottom. All 10 considered climate change, this is Nelson, to be a major problem, and one person, they're all pseudonyms here, it's been a constant worry of mine ever since I was little. Kira, I should talk about Nelson. Nelson's somewhat unique. I was there in 2017. The NDP got elected provincially. The Greens were second, and the right-wing Liberal Party, there is no Conservative Party in BC, the Speaker, was down near there. So that's interesting, where the Greens and NDP battle it out federally, too. So this gal, or woman, young, 16, 17-year-old, I must admit I'm surprised more people aren't concerned about climate change. 2 minutes, here we go. Okay, 9 said it was caused by burning of fossil fuels, 2 said deforestation, 2 said farming practices. 1, and this was the woman, young woman who was homeschooled, the 9 others went to high school, and she said it's a natural phenomenon. She was the only one from a very conservative Christian family. All 10 could speak to the major problems, forest fires, but if you live in Nelson in the summers, you know forest fires is really big. Climate change is going to affect my generation and forthcoming generations in a negative way. Like sustainability, growing enough food for everyone, maybe we won't be able to talk. 9 of 10 of these students said individuals can make a difference, buy electric cars, solar panels, blah, blah, blah. All said the government, I like this, had a role to play. I'm okay with government. I don't have that fear of let's just have small government, and I'm no libertarian. I don't, maybe on social issues I might be a libertarian. Women's right to choose, gay marriage, all that. But not on economics. And 6 of the 10, I didn't ask them, was unsolicited, said they'd either vote NDP or Green. Key finding, the obstacles. One girl said government's beholden to the fossil fuel industries, even gives them money, $58 billion in Canada. That's crazy. They make a lot of money already. If people work, this one I do agree with. If people work in an industry that might close down, they don't want to go green. Yeah. That's standard of living. The guy before I missed it, Thomas, he was hinting at that psychic numbing. It's so overwhelming. I just don't want to talk about it. And then Teresa realized it's already geared toward fossil fuel. There's 2 more to do, 2 more findings, or 3. There's 8. Key finding, let's see. I was impressed. These guys, I'd never heard of Easy Bib. Hands up, you heard of Easy Bib? Okay, 1 person. And that's to check whether the information is accurate or not. And the librarians in Nelson were teaching the students how to do that. I went online to check that out, and I said, oh, this is nice. And okay, so anyway, these students had 9 of the time done, eh? Okay, all right, that's too bad. All right, I guess I got to do it though. Major sources of information. They were really pro-teachers. That's the biggest thing that was different. I'm just going to take 30 seconds, Emily. The Nelson people had teachers going from grade 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, librarians. The students were there. In Saskatoon, 3 of the 10 students had taken a course called Environmental Studies 10. They were in on it. The other 7 just said it doesn't affect them. Climate change means nothing. So education for sure. And one other thing, she's appeared. We shouldn't be surprised about the youth. Greta Thunberg, right? And she's the one from Sweden that said, let's do the climate strike. And that's it. That's my knowledge of Swedish strike for climate. That's about as much. And there's Montreal. That's how many students took off March 15th. There is hope, right? And I won't do this one, but the Labour government says any company that will not take on climate change are taken off the stock market if they get in to England. And that's all I can do. I ran out of time, as I knew I would. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay.
Emily's going to talk about petropedagogy, fossil fuel interest, and obstruction, climate justice, and Emily's from the University of Regina.
Thanks. I didn't need an applause. Thanks for coming out at the end of the day. I'm going to also go really quickly. I have my stopwatch here. This is based off of paper that Nicholas Day, who's in the audience, worked on as well, that we're just in final revision stages with environmental education research, so hopefully it should be available soon. I am not a scholar of education. I am a geography and environmental studies prof, and therefore, that's a caveat. So, just to get right in, because we don't have a lot of time, I've been reading recently this book by Donald Gutstein, and his new book shows how fossil fuel interests, many of these interests are headed by Canadians, have actively stalled action on climate change, moving the discourse away from the kinds of policies and regulations that are needed to create a zero-carbon world and towards market-based solutions that only marginally cut carbon dioxide emissions. And so his book's really interesting and goes back and looks at sort of the history of the UN conferences on human and environment and how this compromise comes to sort of limit the idea of limits on growth and instead to pivot towards the idea that the environment can be consistent with economic growth. And key to this strategy is really focusing on thwarting the responsibility and culpability for fossil fuel pollution with industry and thereby avoiding regulation on industry and promoting discourses of individual consumer responsibility and culpability. And so Sorry. Another premise, I guess, of this presentation is the idea that we do need to transition. And I think that's probably clear to most people in the audience, but if we just look at the latest IPCC report, global greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 40% below 2010 levels by 2030 and must approach net zero by 2050. So the days of talking about making efficiencies around the edges are over. We need a wholesale scale transition. And in Canada, 27% of our national greenhouse gas emissions come from the oil and gas industry alone. That doesn't even include burning oil and gas. That just includes producing oil and gas. So if we're ever going to get to 40% less or net zero, the oil and gas industry has to be tackled. And that's just a conversation we have to start having in this country, and we're not. Fossil fuel corporations plan, actually, though, to expand their production by 33% by 2035, according to a 2018 Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers study. So you can see the inconsistency between these things. Canada is in the top 3 greenhouse gas emitters per capita, and unlike what our politicians would have to say about our total emissions, we're actually one of the top 10 emitters on an absolute basis in the world. So that's just to say we need a transition. It has to involve the oil and gas industry, and there's a large constellation of interests that are preventing this. And this is where we come to the idea of regime of obstruction. So this is the title of a forthcoming book edited by Bill Carroll and part of the Corporate Mapping Project. You might have seen the logo on my first slide. Lori is here as well. Some of us are part of this Corporate Mapping Project looking at the corporate interests and power of the carbon extractive industries in Western Canada. And he's come up with the title for this book, Regime of Obstruction. They're actually from another book that he wrote with Sapinski. There's a nice little graph about how, or depiction of how he understands corporate power. And if we can apply this to the oil and gas industry, we can really look at this we can really look at this depiction of corporate power, and we can see the modalities through which corporations exert their power and influence. And as applied to fossil fuels, we can see how they assemble their regime of obstruction. So in this paper, we're looking at this regime of obstruction and how it plays out in K-12 education in Saskatchewan. We're mostly interested in fossil fuel corporations' cultural influence on a key institution of civil society, public schools. So as outlined by Carroll and the other contributors to that book, which will be coming out next year, this regime of obstruction includes the discursive power of fossil fuel corporations to shape norms, values, and beliefs through campaigns and initiatives that, quote, secure popular consent and co-opt, disorganize, or marginalize dissenting perspectives. These campaigns and initiatives are often advanced by fossil fuel interests through policy planning groups, political parties, lobbies, and industry groups, universities, research centers, community organizations, AstroTurf advocacy groups such as Canada's Energy Citizens. But these campaigns, we argue in the paper, also can be understood as initiatives that are also advanced through what we term petropedagogy, which we contend is an important arm of the regime of obstruction. So the study design, we did interviews with 21 teachers, primarily grades 7 to 12, 3 out-of-classroom educational employees, these would be like curriculum consultants, 2 administrators, and 3 representatives from what I'll call here third-party nonprofit organizations, and I'll give you a little bit more sense of who they are in a second. And we also included a discourse analysis of resources that are published by these third-party nonprofit organizations, resources available through the Saskatchewan curriculum website, and news articles pertaining to energy and climate change education in the province. It's a Saskatchewan-focused study. And so those third-party nonprofits, we only got interviews with 3, but we identified these actors in the landscape of Saskatchewan's third-party nonprofits who are making contributions to education in the area of climate change and energy. So the first group are industry-funded organizations. They're all nonprofits. Energy in Action, which no longer exists anymore, unfortunately. I don't really have time to tell you any context about these organizations. Inside Education, they're prolific, based out of Calgary. You can see some of their sponsors there. Seeds, which has just undergone a new rebranding, and you might know it for green schools. It used to be have like a lot of green schools in Saskatchewan. Environmental nonprofits, there's really only one in the province, Saskatchewan Environmental Society, and Crown Corporations, Sask Energy, and Sask Power. So that was what we identified as the sort of constellation of third-party groups that are providing resources or professional development around areas of climate change and energy in the province. And I'll just note that the discourses that I'm about to identify apply less to so the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. Really only number 4 on the next slide applies to them, but I'm going to speak about them as if it applies to all of them just for brevity here. And I don't have time to get into the nuance. Oh, and teachers were recruited, based on either one, having participated in programs provided by organizations on topics of energy and climate change education or using their resources, or 2, that they were teaching about energy and climate change in rural oil-producing communities in the province. So we were specifically also looking at what are the discourses around oil and energy and climate change in oil-producing areas of the province. So we came up with the 4 sort of core narratives that are advanced by the nonprofits, and they kind of build on one another. You can see what they are here. Number 1, fossil fuel interests and perspectives are legitimate and necessary. Without them, learning is unbalanced and biased. Okay, and this has a lot of purchase in classrooms. Teachers want to be understood as objective and neutral, and there's this idea that if you don't include industry perspectives, you're biased and somehow, being a radical environmentalist. So if you look back at, I'm not going to say more about that because of time. The second one is fossil fuel products are central to modern life. So a lot of these third-party organizations provide resources where students reflect on all the ways in which our everyday lives are dependent on oil, right? And the sort of corollary to that is that because they're so central to modern life, if we actually talk about getting rid of or transitioning off of fossil fuels, what we're talking about is relegating ourselves to a pre-industrial society and sort of ripping away modernity. The third is that industry is supporting environmental responsibility, particularly on local issues. So actually, industry often pivots from the topic of climate change. They'll talk about the problem, and then when they go to the solutions, they talk about something that actually has very little to do with greenhouse gas emissions, but is another local environmental issue, right? Whether it's recycling or building garden beds in schoolyards. We'll get to some examples. We could understand this as a form of greenwashing then. And the fourth is that individual actions are adequate and appropriate responses to the problem of climate change. So in the paper, we go into more details about how and where these discourses are found. I don't have time to do that today. And I can't see my timer anymore. But I'm going to go on to the last substantive part of the paper where we look at how teachers are enacting these discourses in their classrooms. And again, I'm not a scholar of education, and my goal here is not to be, thank you, critical of teachers and tell teachers how they should be doing it. I think it's really interesting. These discourses are hegemonic, another thing that we argue in the paper, and it's not any individual teacher's fault, so to speak, that they're enacting this petropedagogy. So I want to make that disclaimer. And I want to say that probably due to a renewed science curriculum, what we found is that climate change is being taught in schools in Saskatchewan, which is good and a good first step, but that teaching about the possibility of transitioning off of fossil fuels is not. And in fact, that possibility, the very idea that there could be a world post-oil or post-carbon, is foreclosed specifically by the adoption among teachers of industry discourses, those 4 that I outlined. And I'm just going to spend the rest of my time giving you a sense of how those played out through a selection of different teachers' interviews about their teaching practices. Before I go to this, sorry, I've fallen away from my notes now. There is this idea in science literacy that just teaching kids more about climate change, more about ecology, more about anthropocentrism will somehow lead them magically to have the tools needed to address the huge problem of climate change. And kind of what we're doing here is also showing that the nonprofit organizations, as they're engaging, also have an agenda in building a certain type of hegemony. They're circulating their narratives about energy and climate change problems, what the problem is, and what the solution is as truth. And they're depending on teachers to enact these ideologies as common sense in their classroom. So we name the circulation and enactment of these discourses as petropedagogy, and again call it an integral arm of the regime of obstruction that is actively blocking a transition to post-carbon economies. So the first one of those discourses is balance, or bringing in industry's perspectives. Both sides, we have to have both sides, or else we're unbalanced, So for one self-described tree hugger and educator who participated in an inside education professional development program, the exposure to a single presentation from the oil industry during a 3-day workshop changed her perspective on fracking significantly. According to her, she went in pretty like, nope, there's no way fracking is a good thing. And I think the presenter did a pretty good job persuading me. I remember thinking, oh, okay, so it's not nearly as bad as I thought it was. I'm not anti-fracking anymore. When we asked this teacher how this change of perspective impacted her teaching, she surmised that had she continued teaching social studies, it would have impacted my teaching a lot because I would have been able to see things from other perspectives. I really did come from a very tree hugger kind of perspective. And now if I continued to teach social studies, it would have probably lent itself to me inviting speakers from industry into my classroom. So you can see how effective this is. For another teacher, a tour of the Alberta tar sands delivered by Inside Education had a similar impact. Asked whether her perception of the industry improved as a result of the tour, she stated, "Before the tour, I would have felt somewhat more negative. So, I mean, it brought me up to neutral. How's that? And thus, I was able to be very neutral with the students and have them come up with their own opinions. It's not my job to force them what I think, right?" And on the topic of incorporating industry perspectives into the classroom, the same teacher explained that she now considers a project one-sided if she can't incorporate industry's voice. So we can see kind of the effects of this. Threats to oil are equivalent to threats to life or modernity. The educators we interviewed coupled a commitment to balance and representing all perspectives with a consistent message that it was not reasonable for societies to consider transitioning off of fossil fuels because such a transformation would threaten modern standards of living. As the following teacher explained, okay, I'll try to, just cut things. Alternatives to fossil fuel economies can be understood as threats to life itself in oil-producing communities. So now I just have to abandon the rest of them. Then there was, we can marry extraction and environment. So because, because we can't abandon oil, therefore we have to merge extraction and environment. The government's doing things, industry's doing things. And therefore, if the government and industry are doing things, it must be up to individuals to change their own particular lives and their own practices within their lives in order to address the problem. So that's basically how the climate obstructionism works. And this is what, go ahead.
So we have one more. Obviously, this was a packed session, right? It's kind of nuts to do 3 of this depth in 45 minutes. But we have one more, and it's Shelby Adams, and Shelby's talk is on Southeast Saskatchewan oilfield workers' views on climate change. Thank you.
I'm going to take this off here. Hello? Okay. I like to move around. I'm a phys ed major. I would just like to start off by thanking Emily, who is actually my supervisor for my thesis project. And I would also like to thank Dr. Garth Pickard, who's in the audience, who was my outdoor education mentor at the University of Regina and has inspired me in many aspects of my life. So thanks, Garth. As you can see there, my background is public education. I'm a teacher. So I really don't claim to know a lot about the oil industry. And you might be sitting there thinking, well, you're a teacher. Why did you do your master's thesis in oil field research? And I'll get to that a little bit later, but I would just like to start by, saying I encourage my students to take risks and push their comfort zones and try something different. So I thought I should heed my own, preachings there, and I decided to try something completely out of my comfort zone. If you haven't done so already, I would just like you to take a second and read the quotation at the bottom of the slide here. It's from anybody that teaches high school English will know To Kill a Mockingbird. First of all, he said, if you can learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a man until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. And I just think that's a very powerful quote that I would like to start my presentation with. I would just like to start by posing a question, and that is, how many of you in the audience, have a family member, friend, acquaintance, know somebody that works for the oil industry in some manner? Please raise your hands. Everyone. Sorry, most everyone, okay? So like you, I have a lot of, family, friends, acquaintances that work for the oil industry, and actually this is how I would like to start my story here. So I was born and raised 30 years in Moose Mountain Provincial Park, which is the black arrow right here, right in the very southeast corner of the province. So you can see Saskatoon, Regina, very southeast corner. So this is a forest island in the middle of the prairies, 100,000 acres. So this is where I grew up. But all of the economic industries surrounding the park are agriculture and oil field. So growing up, like I said, a lot of my family and friends worked for the oil industry. Good, hardworking people. I just didn't think anything of that. And then I went on to the University of Regina, started taking some environmental education courses, and I began to learn about the effects that this industry is having on the environment. But I also started to hear some stigmas and some stereotypes that I heard about a group of people that I really cared about, family, friends, and it was really hard for me. I felt very stuck in the middle as I began to grow some environmentalist roots, yet I felt obligated and loyal to the people back home that are working for this extractive industry. So this is how I got the formulation of my thesis topic, which is, what are oilfield workers in the Moose Mountain area of the province? What are their views towards climate change and environmental issues? And then my sub-questions under that. So how did their connection to the land influence their perspectives? All of the people that I interviewed either live within the park or surrounding the provincial park within about 50 kilometers. What are their views of the oil industry and how it impacts the environment? I think we talk a lot, with environmentalists and other environmentalists, and not often enough do we delve into sort of the other side of the coin and see what those perspectives are. And then lastly, how do they navigate any perceived conflict between the oil field and the environment, regarding their identity, sorry. So just quickly, for time's sake, the aims of my study was just to minimize ignorance towards workers in Canada's second largest oil producing province. We're second to Alberta. And the oil and gas industry in Saskatchewan employs over 25,000 people. I wanted to try to help bridge relationships between oilfield workers and environmentalists. There's a lot of us versus them kinds of language that you hear on a daily basis, and I don't like that kind of partisan sort of thinking. And then lastly, understand how oil workers perceive climate issues in order to work together to support a different future for sustainable energy. Again, I think it's very powerful to hear, opinions from the other side of the coin, and how can we learn from that, and how can we mobilize people to work towards a different future of sustainable energy. Some big ideas in the corner there. So just very quickly, my theory was qualitative research and inspired by grounded theory principles. So I interviewed 15 semi-structured interviews of men and women actively working in the oil field in some manner. So service rigs, drilling rigs, hydro truck vac, geologists, service workers, production workers. The experience range was 8 months, so just starting out in the profession, to 40 years. So there's an average years of experience level there of 17 years. The age range was 25 to 67 years old with an average age of 42. And like I said, some of them, almost half there, I guess, reside actually in the park, and the rest of the workers very close to the park. Educational backgrounds, they all at least had a high school diploma, and then there was 3 workers, oil field workers, that had 3 bachelor's degrees. So the first finding that really shone through loud and clear for me is that every worker, regardless of gender, age, levels of experience, or occupation that they held within the industry, sense of place shone through very loud and clear. So they talked about, the effective aspects of the park that they love, recreation opportunities, hunting, fishing, sustenance, things they like to do in the park all year round. And then importantly also was the affective component of that sense of place in the park. So this was everything from, they felt responsible as locals in that community to ensure the sustainability of the community, both economically and environmentally. They talked a lot about the golden rule, that they want to work in a way that, respect others' lands like they would want their lands respected. And multiple people that I interviewed were actually farmers as well. So they did oil and they farmed. So they talked about that connection to the land and that reciprocal sort of generosity sort of relationship. They also talked a lot about the things that the oil companies are doing to promote the economic and environmental sustainability might not be the best word for the area. So everything from donating to the local sports teams, the swimming pool, the hockey teams, the volleyball teams, all of that. And they feel, and when I talked to them, and I wasn't afraid to say, well, is your company just doing this to look good, in the eyes of the community members and please the public? And some of them would say, yes, that's definitely a part of it, but what company doesn't do that, try and have good PR work in the community? But they said, my son is playing on that hockey team, or, my daughter's playing on that volleyball team, or, we want to have the facilities in our community for the people in our community to use, so we're very proud to be donating towards that. Here's a quote from one of the maintenance workers, if you haven't, and this is a picture of him and his daughter. I've lived in this area pretty much my whole life, and I've always been concerned about the environment, especially in our area. We live in a provincial park, which is just beautiful, and I think it's important that we look after it for future generations. Very powerful. So another finding that was very interesting to me is the oil field workers are very conflicted on their views and how they feel about climate change. So 14 out of 15 participants did believe that, yes, climate change is happening, this is a thing, but they were quite conflicted on, how much humans are contributing, how much, Saskatchewanians are contributing. There was only one that directly connected the relationship of the oil and gas industry's role in catalyzing anthropogenic climate change. So it was very interesting that, when I asked what they thought the main contributor, what's causing climate change, many of them mentioned, natural causes. It's the volcanoes, it's the Earth's natural cycles. But then as we got into it in our conversations in the interview, they blamed humans for most of the Earth's ills, including deforestation, pollution, plastic, overpopulation, overconsumption. So you can see a conflict there, right? They're mentioning, well, it's natural, but this is what we're doing that's making it really bad. So you can see that they're adopting various worldviews and from different sources. There was a lot of talk with distrust in media, even politicians on both sides of that coin. They call it, the green tree hugger side and then otherwise. And then it was also very interesting when I asked them, okay, well, what's the solution to climate change? When they started with a natural cause, so I was expecting an answer of, well, we can't do anything because it's natural, but all 15 of them, and only 14 out of 15 believed in climate change, yet all 15 of the participants, when I asked them what are the solutions, they all came up with something, which was also very interesting and conflicting. So that was things like renewable energy. I was very shocked at how many of the oil field workers that I talked to were pro-renewable energy. That really surprised me. They talked about individual lifestyle choices, less consumption, public transit, things like that. And of course, the faith in technological advancement to get us where we need to be. And the last finding that I'd like to talk about just quickly is the future of oil in Saskatchewan. So again, the workers that I talked to, there was a wide range of what they think the future of oil in the province will actually look like. They believe that oil in the province will, the range was, 15 to 150 years. So I had a participant say, yeah, 10, 15 years, it's going to be done. And I had a participant say, oh, we're good for at least another 150 years. So even within those 15 workers that I interviewed, there's a wide range of opinion on how much longer, oil is going to be a prominent energy source in this province. So another thing, like I said, I was surprised about how open they were to renewable energy is that's what they think the solution is right now, is to have a balance between renewable energy and fossil fuels at this time until society can wean off fossil fuels and become slowly renewable energy, which was very surprising to me, and I'm sure some of you are surprised as well. They talked about wind farms, solar came up. Pros and cons of renewables were mentioned, of course, but everybody has those conversations. And another important finding that I found regarding the future of oil in Saskatchewan is there's a very large disconnect between the workers believe that the environmental regulations that govern their jobs are very sound and adequate and are doing good things for environmental protection and conservation. And a lot of academic research is saying the opposite. It's doing very little for environmental protection, and it needs to be phased out yesterday. So there's a big disconnect between those two sides, and a huge lack of communication and a big gap there that I think warrants more research. So taking the work forward. So now what? One thing that I really want to express is every single worker, thanked me for sitting down and for them to be able to share their story and their experiences. And I think that was very powerful. They thanked me. Thanks for not digging on the, H2S level of this well and just sitting down and having a conversation, not environmentalist to oil worker, but human to human, and just help eliminating that us versus them narrative that so often happens. I think oil field workers and extractive industry narratives need to be a part of the climate change solutions to help. We need, research is showing we don't just need more science and more education, right? We need different science and different education. And I think the ground level perspectives is very important. There's a lot of knowledge at that level. And again, here's another oil field worker, picture of his kids enjoying biking in the park. And just a quote from him, so my children are going to be on the same planet as the tree-hugging hippie environmentalist children are going to be on. They acknowledge that, and they accept that, and they're embracing that. So just to finish, we are all in this together. So I think it's important for everybody to be open-minded and check your own assumptions and your own biases, when working with people that are different from you. So, thank you.
We have 10 minutes for questions. Oh, okay. If you have a question, you got to go to a microphone. Okay.
Everyone's tired.
We're just passing the microphone around behind you.
Why don't you come up here too?
So it's really thanks to all of you for that was really cool. So, and I'm sorry I didn't get all the names, but I'm interested in. So we had some. I heard from the gentleman that there's this big problem, and we should be more strident in our work, and that's. I heard from the lady on my left that this notion of being super careful, or perhaps paying more attention to the messages coming out of groups like Inside Education, and so on. And then, so my question though is for the teacher on the right, and just would you care to comment on what you think you and your colleagues could get away with where you teach, in terms of addressing perhaps the concern about the co-opted education programs, or the concern that we don't have time to play Mr. Nice Guy, we have to go for the gusto, as the gentleman said. So that's my question to the Shelby. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for your question. I guess I would just say that, so the schools that I've taught at, there's no school in the park. So the schools are all in surrounding rural communities, largely very conservative, very right wing. So, it's a very sensitive nature. And so I think, it warrants sensitivity. I was talking to Tim Swinehart after his presentation yesterday, and I told him about my experience because he said, we have to teach against fossil fuels. And I said, I think we need to be careful with that in certain areas because, when a lot of students, fathers and uncles and grandpas are working in those industries, right? If you just barrel forth and say, this is horrible and we need to wean this off, right? You're gonna get a resistance back, and I don't think that's the best way to go at it. I think finding common ground is the best way to go at it. Because, a lot of times with students, they open their mouth in class and I can hear their parents' views coming out of their mouth, right? And so, if at the end of the day the student has to choose between their parents' beliefs and, say my beliefs are, climate lessons in the classroom, 9 out of 10 times they're gonna go with their parents. Right? So I think it's important to, like they said, it's dangerous to present both sides equally, and I agree with that, but I also think there needs to be some sensitivity around the language that we use, and trying to avoid that sort of us versus them, pitching things against each other like a choice, like you need to choose between this or this. Chris Turner's book, The Patch, he wrote, "We are the patch." Whether we like to admit it or not, we were all a part of this, fossil fuel. Unless you live in Saskatoon and biked here today, right? Everybody got here in a car or a plane to this conference, right? And somebody's working to provide that fuel for you to get to this conference. So, I think we just need to come at it with some sensitivity. And, I think you do that by getting to know your students and your students' families. And then I think from there, you can learn how hard you can push or what kinds of, and I think just providing experiences for them too. To see other sides, to do experiential learning. I think that's how you reach those students in those communities.
So Nick, who's the co-author on this paper, is also going to be a teacher. Nick is just graduated from the University of Regina, and he might also like to answer the question.
Thank you. Yeah, I just finished my ed degree, so I came into this research very curious about what's my career going to be like, and how could I use this profession to end fossil capitalism. And so this research was super interesting for that, because I think part of why it's so difficult to take up these topics and why the backlash exists that you're talking about is the narrative that Emily exposed in this research that has been propagated by fossil corporations for so long, to say that if you do that, you're just indoctrinating kids and you're just being very biased. And that by exposing where that came from, I think it made me feel much more empowered to take it on bluntly and directly. And so, in other words, not shy away from it and say with students, we're here to challenge fossil capitalism by showing how it works. And then, yeah, there may be conflict, but maybe you can get past that resistance by saying we're looking at how fossil capitalism works. And to do that, I think we need to organize as teachers, because if like you said earlier today, Josh, what do you do about that teacher or that parent who says there's no place for activism in schools? Well, maybe right now, not that much, because if you're by yourself, what can you say, right? But if we start redefining the profession to say, I'm not afraid of that objection, right? Maybe things could change. I don't know.
And then finally, I just want to say on that topic, that idea that we can't criticize oil. I've done a lot of work too in rural communities in Saskatchewan with oil field workers and farmers, but that idea that we can't say anything against it because the parents of students are in this industry and it's very personal, actually comes from the whole solution being individual. If individuals are responsible for climate change through their individual actions, then also their parents who are working in the industry are individually responsible for perpetuating the problem, right? So we have to get away from that narrative that it's individuals, in the same way as it's nobody's fault that they seek gainful employment in an economy as it exists. So I think like getting away from that individual narrative is key to like both sides of this problem.
I guess you have to go to a microphone.
I'll just speak loudly. Do you see like more momentum in terms of the kind of research that y'all are doing in terms of interrogating the school curriculum, or the work that you've done in terms of interviewing the workers within the industry? Like, do you see more of that picking up, or is it pretty isolated? And did you have like a body of work that you could draw on as well?
I'll start. I looked long and hard to find a study that asked, like specifically sat down and asked oil field workers what they think about climate change, and I couldn't find it. And I remember having a conversation with somebody at Royal Road saying, I don't think I should do this because I can't find any literature on it, and it could be bad. And she said, well, no, that's good. There's a gap for that. So, but it's a bit of a, I think that's a strength and weakness of my study. So the fact that I knew all of the workers that I interviewed, and I had multiple participants tell me, if it wasn't you, and we know you from the community and your reputation and your family, we wouldn't have agreed to do this interview. And I got that a lot. So I think that's a strength and weakness of my study, because they were willing to sit down and have a conversation. But also I know that, if I was somebody coming from maybe somewhere else, they wouldn't have been as forthcoming with that information. So is there traction for specifically sitting down and talking about climate change with oilfield workers? I mean, Emily's doing a lot of great work with that with rural, but not to my awareness there is a lot of that. I think there needs to be more of that, but not right now, I don't think. There's still a pretty big gap in that, I think.
Shelby, I appreciate your position. As a teacher, I don't think it's my job to belittle or devalue students' parents. That puts students in a very bad position. Emily, do you have any idea of, speaking of value, a dollar value that in a year, a dollar value that petrochemical companies have spent in education?
No, very interesting question. There's a couple big organizations. I'm not sure whether they would divulge that, but it would be an interesting number to know, yeah.
I just wanted to thank you for providing this, I guess, eclectic kind of orientation to this important aspect. I think, from my perspective, no one here is belittling anybody in this sense. What I'm hearing is that collectively we have to engage people in this process. And what I'm also hearing is it's all about principles and not personalities. In other words, we have to come together regardless of occupation, regardless of whether I'm a parent, grandparent, or child for that matter, and actually be factual and truthful and honest by first articulating that people are, and I guess I'm mentioning this again, there is a feeling. We feel as human beings what we are anxious about or concerned about. And actually having us start to talk about how we feel about this and why we feel that we should do this or why I think this way starts to actually bring the humanness to the situation. And I don't think we create those environments, those round tables, those ideas of open discussion to that particular orientation. And it's usually us against we, them, or vice versa. The teacher's role I believe, is the caregiver of the earth. And the interesting thing is that they're handicapped, or they're impeded, I should say, by the realities of our society, not understanding the critical, I would say, gravity of their jobs. So the question then becomes, how collectively can all of us teachers, and Emily, you are a teacher, how can we collectively start this process? As we know, it's serious. Now, we can come together in a conference. My thesis is, okay, this is how next happens. But my biggest question is, what happens next? And regardless of stripe or whatever the case may be, this has to happen. And so I think the problem here is to discuss where we go from here in a very concrete and realistic and humanistic way.